Toan made his decision in less than a second, and that single second was enough to destroy the life he once had forever. As his mother's cold voice still lingered behind him and the weight of her threat pressed down on everyone standing in that small farmyard, he reached out, grabbed Tu Diem's trembling hand, and said in a low but unwavering voice that cut through all the chaos, "We are getting married today." The words didn't sound loud, but they carried a force that silenced everything, even the wind seemed to stop. Tu Diem froze, her tear-filled eyes locking onto his face as if trying to confirm that what she had just heard was real. She had expected hesitation, doubt, maybe even fear after everything his mother had revealed about her past, but instead, he chose her instantly, without looking back, without questioning, and that choice shook her far more than any accusation ever could. Behind them, his mother let out a soft laugh. The kind of laugh that didn't come from amusement but from absolute control, from someone who believed she had already won. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she spoke again, each word carefully measured and colder than the last. "If you walk away now, you are no longer my son." The sentence dropped like a blade, cutting through whatever connection still existed between them. The villagers stood frozen, no one dared to speak, because everyone understood what that meant. It wasn't just about family, it was about power, wealth, identity. Everything Toan had been born into would disappear in an instant, and yet, Toan didn't even turn around, not even once. Instead, he tightened his grip on Tu Diem's hand and started walking, each step steady, deliberate, as if he had already accepted the consequences long before this moment arrived. The ground beneath his feet felt heavier than ever, but his mind was clear. Clearer than it had been in years, because for the first time, he wasn't choosing based on expectation, responsibility, or pressure. He was choosing based on what he truly wanted, and what he wanted was standing right beside him, silent, shaken, but still holding on to him like he was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. The villagers parted slightly as they walked past, their eyes filled with confusion, shock, even fear. Some of them whispered, others simply stared, as if they were watching something they didn't fully understand, something too big for their world. The village chief tried to step forward, perhaps to stop them or say something, but in the end, he didn't, because deep down, he knew this was no longer something anyone there could control. The road leading out of the village stretched ahead, quiet and empty, the earlier chaos now replaced by a strange, heavy silence. Tu Diem walked beside Toan, her hand still in his, but her mind was far from calm. Thoughts collided inside her, questions she didn't dare to ask, fears she didn't know how to express. She had lived her entire life with very little. She wasn't afraid of losing material things, but this was different. This was about him, about what he was giving up, about whether she was worth that sacrifice. She glanced at him several times, searching his face for even the smallest sign of doubt, but there was none, only quiet determination, and that somehow made her heart ache even more. After what felt like hours but was only a short journey, they reached the town. The small marriage registration office stood quietly at the edge of the street, its faded paint and worn-out door making it look almost forgotten. But for them, it became the center of everything. They stopped for a moment outside, neither of them speaking, as if both understood that once they stepped inside, there would be no turning back, no second chances, no undoing what was about to happen. Toan was the first to move. He opened the door and walked in. Tu Diem followed. The office was simple, quiet, almost empty. A middle-aged officer looked up from his desk, slightly surprised to see them, especially the urgency in their expressions. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone neutral but curious. Toan stepped forward without hesitation. "We want to register our marriage today." There was a brief pause. The officer studied them for a moment, perhaps sensing that something unusual was happening, but in the end, he nodded and began preparing the paperwork. Forms were placed on the desk, pens handed over, instructions given in a calm, routine manner that felt almost disconnected from the emotional storm the two of them were experiencing. Toan picked up the pen first. His hand was steady. There was no hesitation. He signed his name in one smooth motion, the ink marking more than just paper. It marked the end of his past, the final break from everything he had been, everything his family had built, everything he was expected to inherit. It was final, irreversible. Then came Tu Diem's turn. She stared at the paper. At her name. At the space where she needed to sign. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the pen, not because she didn't want this, but because she understood too well what it meant. This wasn't just marriage, it was a decision that would change both their lives forever, a decision that came with consequences she couldn't fully predict. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a brief second, and then signed. The sound of the stamp hitting the paper echoed louder than it should have. It was done. They were husband and wife. No celebration. No witnesses. No blessings. Just silence. But in that silence, something powerful existed, something that didn't need validation from anyone else. When they stepped outside, the sky had turned dark, clouds gathering above them, and within seconds, rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, soaking them completely, but neither of them moved, neither of them tried to run or hide. Toan looked at Tu Diem, water running down his face, mixing with something deeper, something unspoken, and he smiled, tired but real. No matter what happens next, he said quietly, we face it together. Tu Diem nodded, her lips trembling slightly as she smiled back, together. But across the street, unnoticed by both of them, a black car was parked. And inside it, someone was watching. The engine started. And everything was already set in motion. When Toan and Tu Diem returned to the village later that day, the rain had stopped, but something else had changed, something far more unsettling than the storm itself. The warmth they once felt from the villagers was gone, replaced by distance, by hesitation, by eyes that no longer welcomed them the same way. Whispers followed them as they walked, quiet but sharp enough to be felt. The story had spread faster than either of them expected. About Toan's background, about his mother, about the accusations tied to Tu Diem's family. No one knew the full truth, but that didn't matter. Fear didn't need facts, it only needed uncertainty. The village chief approached them, his face serious, his usual kindness replaced by something heavier, something conflicted. We need to talk, he said, leading Toan aside, away from Tu Diem. His voice lowered. You've brought trouble here. Toan frowned. I'll deal with it, he replied, but the chief shook his head immediately. This is not something you can deal with. These are people with power, real power, and if they decide to act, this entire village could suffer. His words weren't angry, they were afraid, and that fear spread quickly, because when fear enters a place like this, it changes everything. That night, silence filled the small house. Tu Diem sat by the window, staring into the darkness, her thoughts heavy, her heart restless. She glanced at Toan, who lay quietly, eyes closed but not truly asleep. Both of them knew something was coming. Neither of them said it out loud, because saying it would make it real. Morning came. And with it, everything collapsed. A group of men arrived at the farm. Not villagers. Not friendly. They carried documents, official, stamped, undeniable, claiming ownership of the land, stating that it was now part of a development project, that Toan and Tu Diem had no legal right to remain. The words were clear, precise, and impossible to argue against. Toan stepped forward, anger rising. This land is ours, he said, but one of the men simply smiled. Not anymore. What followed escalated quickly. Voices raised. Tension exploded. A shove. A fall. Tu Diem cried out. And then, fire. It started small, almost unnoticeable. But within seconds, it spread. The dry wood caught instantly. The wind carried the flames. And suddenly, everything was burning. The farm. Their home. Their future. Toan grabbed Tu Diem, pulling her away as the fire grew uncontrollable. Smoke filled the air, people screamed, but no one stepped in, no one dared, because this was no accident, and everyone knew it. Tu Diem broke down, tears streaming as she watched everything disappear. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I ruined everything." Toan turned to her immediately, holding her tightly. "No," he said firmly, "I chose this. I chose you, and I don't regret it." But then, his phone rang. An unknown number. He answered. Silence. Then a voice. Cold. Calm. "If you want her safe." A pause. "Come back." The call ended. Toan froze. And for the first time, doubt returned. Not about his love, but about the price he might have to pay. The wind carried the ashes into the air. And somewhere, far beyond what he could see, the real game had just begun. The line went dead, but the silence it left behind was far more terrifying than the voice itself. Toan stood there unmoving, his phone still pressed against his ear as if he was hoping the call would come back, that it would somehow undo what had just been said, but deep down, he knew this was only the beginning, not the end. Tu Diem watched him closely, her heart tightening as she saw something change in his expression, not fear, not regret, but something heavier, something darker, a realization that whatever they were facing was no longer just about defiance or sacrifice. It had become a game controlled by someone far more powerful than they imagined. "What did they say?" she asked softly, her voice almost lost in the sound of the wind. Toan lowered the phone slowly. His eyes met hers. For a brief second, everything between them felt fragile again. "They want me to go back," he said. "And if you don't?" He didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was something he didn't want to say out loud. Instead, he looked at the burning remains of their farm, then back at her, his jaw tightening as if he was forcing himself to stay strong. "They won't stop," he finally said. The wind blew harder, carrying ashes into the sky like broken pieces of everything they once had, and in that moment, Tu Diem understood something she had tried to ignore. This was no longer just their love story, it was a war, and the price of that war might be far greater than either of them was ready to pay. Far away, in the city, a figure stood by a glass window, watching the rain fall over endless lights, a phone still in hand, a faint smile appearing for the first time. The game had begun. And this time, no one would walk away untouched.